Kitchen's closed. Come back never, actually.
Sign on the door says you're open until 2. It's 9:30.
The sign's wrong. We decide who we serve in here, and we don't serve your kind.
I'm not looking for trouble, just a meal.
Trouble's exactly what you'll get if you don't turn around and walk back out that door.
Understood. I won't forget this.
Barnard Keen grabbed the stainless coffee pot from the burner and slammed it back down hard enough to rattle every mug on the counter, his voice rising so the whole sun-drenched dining room could hear him announce that the diner had a right to refuse anyone it pleased. Sergeant First Class Deshawn Tate, still in civilian clothes, still nursing his eggs 2 stools down, lowered his fork and looked at the man Barnard had just dismissed. Deshawn had followed that man through 2 combat deployments, a mortar attack in a mountain pass, and a ceremony at the Pentagon. Colonel Humphrey Slate walked out into the bright morning parking lot, and Deshawn quietly pulled up the base commander's direct line. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The sign on the door of Keen's diner had been there for 11 years. Hand-painted red letters on a white board, sun-bleached at the corners, but still perfectly legible. Open daily 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. It swung gently in the October morning breeze as Colonel Humphrey Slate pulled open the glass door and stepped inside. It was 9:32 on a Tuesday morning in Millhaven, North Carolina, and the world was bright. Overhead, fluorescent tubes blazed white across every surface of the dining room, and the wide front windows pulled in long, generous rectangles of October sunlight that fell across the counter stools and the checkered linoleum floor and the backs of a dozen people eating their breakfast without a care. The place smelled like coffee and bacon grease, and the particular comfort of a room full of people who have nowhere urgent to be. Truckers occupied the booths along the far wall, their logistics tablets and paper maps spread beside their plates. A pair of contractors in Carhartt jackets shared a table near the window, talking over blueprints. At the far end of the counter, 3 men in civilian clothes, jeans, flannel shirts, work boots sat with the particular posture of soldiers at rest, spines still carrying the habit of attention even off-duty. The room was full and warm and loud with the ordinary music of forks on plates and coffee cups finding their saucers. Humphrey Slate walked to the counter and took a stool near the middle. He was 54 years old and built the way time builds certain men solidly, without apology. He wore a plain olive Henley, dark jeans, and a pair of clean leather boots that had never needed to be shined because he had never stopped caring for them. He carried no bag, no phone visible, only a worn leather wallet that he set on the counter in front of him, the way a man sets something down when he intends to stay a while. His face was calm. Not the calm of someone suppressing something, but the deeper calm of a man who has survived enough noise to have made peace with silence. He had the kind of stillness that fills a room without announcing itself. The way a large river fills a valley, you notice it not because it is loud, but because suddenly everything else seems to be moving around it. He did not look around for attention. He did not signal anyone. He simply sat and waited, and read the laminated menu that was already propped in front of him. 2 stools to his left, Sergeant First Class Malik Ford was finishing his eggs. Malik was 38, in a gray t-shirt and dark cargo pants, his forearms resting on the counter with the easy stillness of a man comfortable in his body. He had a cup of black coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs and wheat toast, and he had been eating without urgency, glancing occasionally at his phone, the way a man does on a morning when the day has not yet made any demands of him. He had not looked up when the door opened. He looked up now, some instinct firing before his conscious mind caught up, and when he saw who had taken the stool 2 down from his own, he set his fork on the rim of his plate with a precision that was more reflex than intention. He recognized Colonel Humphrey Slate, the way soldiers recognize certain people not just by face, but by the specific gravity they carry. Malik Ford had followed this man through 2 combat deployments. He had been in the vehicle behind Slate's when a roadside device took out the lead Humvee in Kandahar province, and Slate had been out of his door before the dust settled, running forward into the smoke, while everyone else was still finding their bearings. He had watched Slate stand at Pentagon podium and receive a decoration that most people in that room could not have earned in 3 lifetimes. He had, on one occasion that Malik did not discuss with anyone, seen Slate sit alone at a FOB mess table at 0200 hours, reading a handwritten letter with the particular careful attention of a man reading something he cannot afford to lose. Malik Ford did not speak. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down, and watched. Barnard Keen came through the kitchen pass-through door, moving the way he always moved, like a man in a room that belongs to him, which this one did. He was 58 years old and built wide across the shoulders, red-faced in the way of men who have spent years being comfortable and irritable in equal measure. He wore a white short-sleeved diner shirt and dark work pants, and he had a dish rag over one shoulder that he used for everything except dishes. His hair was thin and combed back with conviction. He was laughing at something a regular at the far end of the counter had just said, still carrying the punchline in his expression when his eyes landed on Humphrey Slate. The laugh didn't leave his face all at once. It left the way light leaves a room when a cloud passes gradually and then completely. He walked down the counter and stopped in front of Humphrey Slate with the particular stance of a man who has made a decision and has decided to enjoy making it. "Kitchen's closed," Barnard Keen said. "Come back never, actually." The room did not go silent. That was the thing that would stay with people afterward, the ones who were honest about it. The room did not go silent because most of the room chose not to hear it. The truckers in the booths kept their eyes on their plates. The contractors near the window found something newly interesting in their blueprints. The sounds of the diner continued, the coffee maker hissing, the kitchen radio playing something indistinct, the ordinary percussion of a room full of people who had collectively decided that whatever was happening at the middle of the counter was not their business. Humphrey Slate looked up from the menu. His expression did not change. "Sign on the door says you're open until 2, he said. "It's 9:30. His voice was level and unhurried, the voice of a man who was not raising it because he had never needed to raise it to be heard. Barnard Keen's jaw tightened. He pulled the dish rag off his shoulder and folded it once slowly, in the way men handle objects when they are performing their own authority for an audience. "The sign's wrong," he said, loud enough now that there was no longer any question about who was meant to hear it. The dining room that had been pretending not to listen was now pretending harder. "We decide who we serve in here, and we don't serve your kind." 4 words. 4 words that landed in the bright fluorescent air of that diner and hung there, and the room absorbed them the way rooms absorb ugly things, by going slightly more still, by redirecting eyes, by the sound of a coffee cup being set down just a half-second too carefully. One of the off-duty soldiers at the far end of the counter shifted on his stool. He did not speak. He looked at his plate. Malik Ford did not look at his plate. Malik Ford looked at Humphrey Slate. Humphrey Slate set the menu down flat on the counter. He did not push it away from him. He simply set it down, the way a man concludes something. He looked at Barnard Keen for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to last, and not 1 second more. "I'm not looking for trouble," Humphrey Slate said. "Just a meal." Something moved through Barnard Keen's face, then not doubt exactly, but the closest thing to it that his face knew how to make. It lasted half a second before his jaw reset, and his chest came forward, and his voice climbed to the volume of a man who has decided that the room needs to be reminded who is in charge of it. "Trouble's exactly what you'll get if you don't turn around and walk back out that door." Barnard Keen grabbed the stainless coffee pot from the burner and slammed it back down on the warmer hard enough to rattle every mug on the counter, and the sound cracked through the dining room like a period at the end of a sentence. His voice had gone full now, filling every corner of the sun-flooded room, announcing to the truckers and the contractors and the off-duty soldiers and the cook visible through the pass-through window and the waitress who had stopped walking midway between 2 tables and was standing with a coffee carafe in her hand, announcing to all of them that Keen's Diner had a right to refuse service to anyone it pleased. And that right was being exercised right now, right here, in front of everyone. The waitress Gloria Marsh, who had worked this counter for 11 years and had heard things in this building that she had written down in careful handwriting in a folder she kept at home, stood very still near table 4 and did not move and did not speak, and looked at the floor with the particular expression of a woman who has survived this room by learning exactly when to be invisible. Most of the room looked away. Humphrey Slate did not. He held Barnard Keen's gaze for one final moment. His hands were flat on the counter. They were not shaking. His jaw was not tight. His eyes were not wet. There was no performance of dignity in his face, because dignity in Humphrey Slate was not a performance, it was the structural material the man was built from, load-bearing and unshowy, invisible, until something tried to compromise it and found that it could not. He picked up his wallet from the counter. He stood from the stool. Understood, he said. He said it quietly enough that the room had to choose to hear it, and several people in that room, for the first time in the last 90 seconds, did. I won't forget this. He walked the length of the counter toward the front door without hurrying, without looking back, without any of the performances that the moment might have invited from a lesser man. He pushed open the glass door and stepped out into the bright October morning, and the door swung closed behind him, and the little painted sign open daily 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. swayed once in the displaced air and then settled. Inside, Barnard Keen had already turned back toward the regular at the far end of the counter. His laugh had come back. He was saying something, and the regular was nodding along, and the room was resuming its sounds, the hiss of the coffee maker and the kitchen radio and the careful replacement of forks on plates by people relieved that the moment was over. Malik Ford had not moved from his stool. He sat with his hands around his coffee cup and his eggs going cold on his plate, and he watched Barnard Keen laugh, and then he looked at the glass door through which Humphrey Slate had just walked, and something settled in his face, not anger exactly, though it was related to anger. It was the expression of a man who has witnessed something that cannot be filed under coincidence or misunderstanding or let go without consequence. He thought about Kandahar province. He thought about the Pentagon podium. He thought about every morning formation where that man had stood in front of hundreds of soldiers and carried the weight of their safety and the weight of the army's trust without making it look like weight at all. He pulled his phone from the side pocket of his cargo pants. He opened his contacts and scrolled to a name he had never called for anything casual. Base Commander Direct Line. His thumb hovered over the screen. In the parking lot, Humphrey Slate's truck pulled slowly out into the bright Tuesday morning and turned toward the highway and disappeared. Inside Keen's diner, Barnard Keen was refilling a regular's coffee and still laughing. Malik Ford's thumb did not move yet, but it would. He sat in the parking lot for exactly 4 minutes. Not because he was broken, not because he was fighting back tears or rehearsing words he wished he'd said inside. Colonel Humphrey Slate sat in the driver's seat of his silver Ford F-150 with both hands resting flat on his thighs and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, doing what 30 years of command had trained him to do before any consequential decision. He breathed, and he waited, and he let the noise settle until only the signal remained. The diner's front windows were visible in his rearview mirror. Through the glass, under those blazing overhead fluorescents, he could make out the shapes of men still eating, still talking, still occupying the stools and booths they'd occupied, while a man with 3 decades of service to this country was told, in plain English, in a full room, that he wasn't welcome at the counter. Humphrey turned the key. The engine came to life. He pulled out of the lot and drove north toward Fort Caldwell without looking in the mirror again. The drive was 18 minutes on a clear morning, and every mile of it was familiar enough that his hands knew the road without instruction. He passed the Millhaven Water Tower with its faded blue lettering. He passed the Sunoco station on Route 11 and the scattering of contractor supply yards that lined the approach to the base. Their lots full of rebar and pallets and diesel equipment servicing the infrastructure of a military installation that had been the economic heartbeat of this county for 41 years. He passed the billboard that read "Millhaven welcomes our Fort Caldwell heroes" and did not find it ironic. He'd long since stopped expecting the world to be consistent. What he allowed himself, during those 18 minutes, was memory. He thought about Fort Bragg in 1997, when a superior officer told a 29-year-old Captain Slate that he'd advanced as far as his kind typically did in this branch, and how Humphrey had said nothing, gone back to his quarters, and spent the next 3 years building a service record so precise and so decorated that the comment became a footnote no one mentioned again. He thought about Kandahar in 2009, when a contractor running a forward operating base supply chain refused to look him in the eye during briefings and addressed his junior white staff instead, and how Humphrey had documented every interaction in writing, filed a formal report through proper channels, and watched the contractor's contract quietly expire 6 weeks later without renewal. He thought about Lena. He always thought about Lena when something tried to make him small. She had a theory about that, about the specific psychology of men who use public spaces to strip other men of dignity. She'd written it down somewhere. She wrote most things down. It was one of the first things he'd loved about her, the way she processed the world through a pen-filling composition notebooks, and then leather journals with observations that were so precise they felt like prophecy. Lena Slate had been gone for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Humphrey Slate knew the count the way he knew his own heartbeat. The Fort Caldwell main gate came into view, its brick pillars flanking a broad entrance under a blue morning sky that let in light across the entire approach. 2 sentries in Army combat uniforms stood at their posts, and as Humphrey's truck rolled to the checkpoint, the nearest one leaned forward to verify the decal, then straightened with a snap that was not casual. Word traveled on a base the way weather traveled fast and through everything. These sentries knew whose truck this was. The recognition in their posture was not performance. It was the instinctive response of trained personnel in the presence of their commanding officer. Humphrey Slate returned the salute with a measured lift of 2 fingers from the wheel and drove through. He did not live in the largest quarters on post, though he was entitled to them. He lived in a 3-bedroom house on Mercer Lane with a covered front porch and a kitchen that got good morning light from the east-facing window above the sink. He'd repainted it himself the summer after Lena died, not because it needed painting, but because he'd needed something his hands could finish. He parked, went inside, and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the overhead light. He washed his hands at the sink. He took 2 eggs and a block of cheddar from the refrigerator and cooked them without ceremony in a cast iron pan while the coffee brewed. He moved through the kitchen the way he moved through everything, with the quiet economy of a man who'd spent decades living in conditions that rewarded efficiency and punished excess. He did not call anyone. He did not open his phone or his laptop or the secure line in his home office. He did not compose an email or draft a complaint or consult with the base legal office or alert his executive officer or do any of the dozen things a man with his title and institutional authority could have done within minutes of leaving that parking lot. He made breakfast. He poured coffee. And then he went to the shelf in the living room where he kept 6 of Lena's journals in chronological order, selected the 3rd one, the dark green one with the cracked spine, and carried it to the kitchen table. It was a ritual, not daily, but consistent. On the days when the world took something from him, he'd read her words until the world gave something back. He knew which entry he was looking for before he found it. He'd read it enough times that the pages fell open close to it on their own. It was dated March 14, 2011. They had been stationed in Virginia. Lena had gone to a school board meeting to advocate for a reading program at the elementary school their youngest attended, and a board member named Gerald something Humphrey had never memorized the last name. Only the behavior had spoken over her 3 times in a row and then suggested her concerns were better directed to the PTA rather than the board. The entry read, "He wasn't trying to silence the argument. He was trying to silence the person making it. Those are different problems. The argument you answer. The person you outlast. Dignity is not something another person gives you permission to have. It exists independent of whether they acknowledge it. The man who refuses to see you is not the authority on whether you exist. H keeps saying I should let it go. I told him letting go and standing still are not the same thing. You can be perfectly still and be gathering everything." Humphrey read it twice, then set the journal down on the table with his hand resting on the open page. You can be perfectly still and be gathering everything. He drank his coffee. Outside, through the east-facing window above the sink, the North Carolina sky was the particular blue that only happened in October, deep and specific and unconditional. He was still sitting there when the phone rang twice from the bedroom and he let it go to message. He was still there when the wind picked up against the front porch and the house settled in the way old houses do when the temperature shifts in the afternoon. He read more of the journal. He found 3 more entries that felt relevant and read them slowly. Not for answers, but for company, for the sound of her thinking. At some point he couldn't have said exactly when he fell asleep at the kitchen table with his hand still on the open page. He did not dream of the diner. He dreamed of Lena laughing at something he'd said in a car somewhere, years ago, and the quality of the light through the car window was exactly right. He did not know, because he had made no calls and received no briefings, that at approximately 10:22 that same morning, Sergeant First Class Malik Ford had dialed an 11-digit number from a bench outside Keen's diner and waited 3 rings before a woman's voice answered. Major Vera Colton was 36 years old, 5'7", and built with the kind of focused intelligence that made people assume she'd missed warmth somewhere along the way until she smiled at a junior clerk's birthday card, and they understood they'd misjudged her entirely. She was the base legal officer at Fort Caldwell, a position she'd held for 2 years, and her office in the Judge Advocate building caught good light from a row of high institutional windows that ran along the east wall and filled the room from mid-morning forward. When Malik Ford called, she was at her desk, reviewing a contract compliance report, her uniform immaculate, her pen moving steadily. She was not prepared for the call to be what it was. Malik Ford delivered his account the way he'd been trained to deliver any after-action information, stripped of commentary, sequenced by time, precise in language. He gave the location first: Keen's Diner, Route 11, Millhaven, then the time, 0847 hours, then the incident, and here his voice tightened slightly, not with emotion, but with the particular compression of a soldier being careful with language he found difficult to contain within the neutral tone that professionalism required. He described what Barnard Keen had said, word for word. He did not paraphrase, he did not soften. He gave Vera Colton the exact language, the way you give a doctor the exact symptom, because accuracy mattered more than comfort. He described the room. Full dining room. Estimated 32 to 35 civilians and off-duty personnel. He named the two soldiers he'd personally recognized: Specialist Chandra Hobbs and Staff Sergeant Leon Prout, both from 2nd Battalion, both in civilian clothes. He noted that neither had intervened or departed. He noted that the room at large had remained silent and seated throughout. He noted that the subject of the incident had responded without escalation, delivered a single statement, "I won't forget this," and exited the premises in a composed manner. Vera Colton's pen had been moving in shorthand the entire time. It kept moving through all of it. Then she asked her question, and it was only one: "Sergeant Ford." Her voice was even and deliberate. "Do you know who that man was?" There was a brief pause on Malik Ford's end, not the pause of uncertainty. The pause of a man making sure the weight of what he was about to say would be received clearly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That was Colonel Humphrey Slate, Base Commander, Fort Caldwell." Vera Colton's pen stopped moving. She looked at the words she'd written on the yellow legal pad in front of her, and then she looked at the window, and then she set the pen down with the careful motion of someone who has just understood that a small fire they were called to assess is, in fact, burning through the wall. She thought about the number before she said it to herself, because she knew it by heart. She knew it the way any base legal officer knows the most significant figure in their institutional responsibility. Fort Caldwell's annual economic footprint in Millhaven, North Carolina, direct local spending across vendors, contractors, hospitality, and retail was $40 million. $40 million that flowed through this community because soldiers lived here, ate here, fueled their vehicles here, stayed in its motels, supplied their operations through its hardware yards, and patronized its restaurants. $40 million that moved because one man had the authority to direct or redirect where and how that base engaged with the local economy. That man had walked into a diner on Route 11 this morning in a plain olive Henley and dark jeans, carrying nothing but a worn leather wallet. And a red-faced restaurant owner had looked at him and seen nobody worth the courtesy of a stool. Vera Colton picked up her pen again. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote 2 words at the top in capital letters and underlined them. Then she went to work. Back on Mercer Lane, the kitchen light had shifted to the long gold of late afternoon. Humphrey Slate slept at his table, one hand open on Lena's words, the October sky burning quietly outside the window. He had not called anyone. He had not moved any pieces. He had made himself a meal and sat at his own table and read his wife's journal until the world felt like it had weight and proportion again. And then he'd let sleep take him the way sleep takes a man who has nothing to prove and nowhere to be until morning. The question that hung over everything, the question that Vera Colton was already beginning to answer in that bright legal office 12 minutes from where he slept, was not whether Humphrey Slate had power. It was what a man with that kind of power looked like when he chose not to use his hands. The sun came up over Fort Caldwell the same way it always did, without ceremony, without permission, flooding the eastern wall of the command building with hard white light that turned every surface into something that mattered. By 0650, the hallways were already alive with the organized sound of military routine. Boots on polished concrete, the low frequency of a printer cycling through its warm-up. A coffee maker somewhere down the corridor releasing steam into the cool morning air. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. Everything moving at the precise speed it was supposed to move. Major Vera Colton arrived at her office at 0620. She had been there most of the night. The document she carried in a plain manila folder was 7 paragraphs long. She had drafted it 4 times, each version slightly more precise than the last, each revision closing another small gap that a defense attorney might one day try to push a finger through. She was not a woman who left gaps. She had graduated second in her class at the Army JAG school at the University of Virginia, had clerked under a federal judge who once told her that the most dangerous legal instrument in any room was a well-written sentence, and she had spent 12 years at Fort Caldwell turning that lesson into a professional philosophy. The memorandum in her folder was not aggressive, it was not emotional, it was airtight. She knocked on Colonel Humphrey Slate's office door at exactly 0700. "Come in." The office caught the morning light through 2 large institutional windows that faced east, and at this hour the room was filled with the kind of clean, unhurried brightness that made everything visible and nothing dramatic. A desk of dark wood, cleared except for a single legal pad and a ceramic mug. An American flag and a unit flag flanked a credenza behind the chair. Along the left wall, a row of framed commendations hung at precisely level intervals, the kind of wall that a person could spend an hour reading if they chose to, each frame containing a different year, a different theater, a different kind of sacrifice measured in formal language and bronze oak leaf clusters. The chapter does not dwell on them. Neither did Humphrey Slate. He was already seated when she entered, wearing his service uniform army green jacket, black tie, silver eagle insignia at his collar. He looked like a man who had slept well, eaten breakfast, and arrived at his desk with no particular weight on him beyond the ordinary weight of command. He gestured toward the chair across from the desk. Vera Colton sat, opened the folder, and placed the memorandum in front of him without a word of preamble. He picked it up. The room was quiet enough that the subtle friction of paper between his fingers was audible. He read from the top, unhurried, without expression. His eyes moved at the pace of a man reading something important, not something surprising. The first paragraph established jurisdiction, the base commander's authority under Army Regulation 600-20 to issue off-post conduct guidance affecting the welfare of assigned personnel. The second paragraph cited the incident in language that was factual, specific, and merciless in its precision. The date, the time, the location, the exact nature of the conduct witnessed by a named non-commissioned officer and 2 additional military personnel present. The third paragraph named Keen's Diner by full legal trade name and street address. The fourth paragraph stated clearly, without embellishment, that the command's endorsement of Keen's Diner as a suitable establishment for military personnel patronage was hereby suspended, effective immediately, pending the conclusion of a formal discrimination review. The remaining paragraphs detailed the review process, the chain of notification, and the standard of conduct expected of all Fort Caldwell personnel during the interim period. Humphrey Slate read it twice. He picked up a pen from beside the legal pad. He made one edit in the third paragraph, a single word replaced with a more precise one, and one edit in the fifth paragraph, adding a clause about the timeline for review notification that Vera Colton had left slightly open-ended. He initialed both corrections in small, clean block letters. Then he signed the bottom of the document with his full title and date, slid it back across the desk, and picked up his coffee mug. He did not say a single word about the diner. He did not say a single word about Barnard Keen. "Anything else this morning, Major?" he asked. Vera Colton looked down at the memorandum in her hands. She had worked for 3 commanders over 12 years. She had never once watched a man with a 40 million annual spending authority sign a document this consequential the way another person signs a permission slip, complete, unhurried, and already finished with it before the ink had dried. She stood, tucked the folder under her arm, and said only, "No, sir, thank you." She was back at her desk by 0712. The document was emailed to every unit commander on the base at exactly 0730. Vera Colton sent it from the official command address, with the subject line formatted in the standard institutional structure, no urgency marker, no exclamation. Nothing that would make a person look at it twice in a crowded inbox, except for the fact that it came from the base commander's office. That was enough. Within 20 minutes, 11 unit commanders had opened it. Within 40 minutes, word had moved through the officer ranks the way important things always moved through a military installation, not loudly, but completely. The duty sergeant at the main administrative building printed 3 copies at 0755 and walked them to the bulletin boards in Building A, the motor pool common area, and the commissary entrance. He used standard thumbtacks. He did not post a note beside them or draw attention to them in any particular way. He simply put them where people would see them, the way you put a fact in a place where it can do its own work. By 0800, two sergeants at the commissary had read it over their morning coffee. By 0815, a corporal had photographed it with his phone. By 0830, it had been forwarded in a group message to 37 personnel who were not on the original distribution list. At 0847, Specialist Derek Prout, 22 years old, Fort Caldwell for 14 months, stationed in the motor pool, wearing his duty uniform of Army combat uniform jacket and trousers, drove a government-adjacent personal vehicle to the address on the memorandum because his sergeant had told him to deliver a physical copy directly to the establishment manager. He had not been told what was in it. He had been told to deliver it, confirm receipt, and return. He was not given a speech. He was not given a tone. He was given a sealed envelope, a name, and a task. He pulled into the parking lot of Keen's Diner at 0903. The breakfast rush was still moving inside. The front windows were wide. The overhead fluorescent tubes blazed in long rows across the ceiling, and the dining room was the particular noisy warmth of a place that had been feeding the same people the same food for 23 years. Truckers at the counter. A booth of county workers. A table near the window with two older men Barnard Keen had known for 30 years. Everything familiar, everything ordinary. Specialist Derek Prout walked in, scanned the room for the manager, and found Barnard Keen behind the counter, refilling the coffee of a man in a John Deere cap. Barnard Keen was wearing a white short-sleeve button-down and dark trousers, the same basic uniform he wore every day. He was in the middle of a story, gesturing with the coffee pot, landing the punchline as the soldier approached. Derek Prout stopped 2 feet from the counter, waited for the laughter to settle, and said, "Sir, this is for you," and placed the sealed envelope on the counter between them. He did not explain it. He did not wait. He walked back out through the glass door and was in his vehicle and out of the parking lot before Barnard Keen had fully looked down at what had been placed in front of him. Barnard Keen held the envelope for a moment with the vague curiosity of a man who receives mail at the counter from time to time. He set the coffee pot down. He opened it with a thumbnail, unfolded the single sheet inside, and read it. It took him approximately 45 seconds. When he finished, he let out a short sound through his nose that was the outer edge of a laugh. He shook his head once in the way a man shakes his head at a mosquito, a minor irritation, briefly acknowledged. He turned to the man in the John Deere cap and said something about government paperwork and how people who couldn't take a joke were the reason this country was going sideways, and the man at the counter chuckled, because that was what men at that counter did when Barnard Keen said things. Barnard Keen walked to the corkboard beside the kitchen, passed through a square of tan cork that held the week's delivery schedule, a reminder about the health inspection due in October, and a takeout menu for the Chinese place 2 towns over that he told himself he was going to try for 8 months. He pushed a red thumbtack through the memorandum and pressed it into the corner of the board. He went back to the counter. He refilled the coffee from the kitchen pass-through. A pair of hands had gone still. Gloria Marsh had been at the griddle since 5:30 in the morning, the way she had been at a griddle in one form or another for the better part of 11 years. She was wearing a pale blue uniform top and black non-slip trousers, her hair wrapped beneath a hairnet, her apron white once, now the softened cream of 10,000 wash cycles tied at her waist in a knot she had made so many times it was almost a reflex. She had seen the soldier come in. She had watched Barnard Keen open the envelope. She had seen the exact shape his face made when he read it and decided it was nothing. She recognized that shape. She had seen it before on the face of a man who had never once believed that anything could touch him and who had been right often enough to stop imagining that it ever would. She looked at the memorandum pinned to the corkboard. She could read the header from where she stood. She could read the official seal, the subject line, the signature block at the bottom. She had seen enough official documents in her time in the context of complaints filed and ignored. In the context of settlements, her co-worker Marcus Webb had described to her in a parking lot 7 years ago. In the context of a system that had shown her, repeatedly, that pieces of paper could be buried just as easily as inconvenient truths. But she had also seen what kind of paper this was. She had seen what office it came from. She had seen whose name was signed at the bottom. Gloria Marsh looked at the memorandum for a long moment. The diner clattered and murmured around her. The griddle hissed. The coffee maker cycled. Barnard Keen's voice carried from the counter, easy and loud, already done with what he'd just held in his hands. Her fingers moved to the knot at her back. She began to untie her apron strings. Not fast, not dramatically, with the quiet, deliberate motion of a woman who had already made up her mind and was simply completing an action she had been waiting 11 years to begin. The knot gave. The apron loosened. She folded it once over her arm and held it in the crook of her elbow. She looked at the memorandum one more time. Barnard Keen didn't understand what he was holding yet. Gloria Marsh did. The first morning, Barnard Keen told himself it was the rain. There had been no rain. The sky over Millhaven on that Thursday was the kind of clear, hard blue that made everything look freshly painted overhead, light pouring through Keen's diner's wide front windows in flat, honest sheets, illuminating every empty stool at the counter, every unoccupied booth in the back row, every table that should have had a coffee cup and a plate of eggs on it and didn't. The breakfast rush, which usually began at 6:45 and built to a controlled roar by 7:30, arrived at something closer to a trickle. 4 regulars, 2 contractors who hadn't heard yet, a trucker passing through who didn't know the name Fort Caldwell and wouldn't have cared. Barnard Keen moved behind the counter with his usual heavy confidence, refilling coffee cups that were barely touched, cracking jokes that landed in empty air, and telling himself that slow mornings happened. Even in a town built on military money, slow mornings happened. By 9 o'clock, the diner had emptied almost entirely. 3 stools occupied out of 12. The back booths, where 6 to 8 soldiers in civilian clothes could usually be found working through plates of biscuits and gravy before a shift change, held nobody. Barnard Keen stood at the end of the counter and looked at those booths for a long moment, the clean tables, the undisturbed napkin dispensers, the salt and pepper shakers standing at perfect attention for nobody, and then he walked into the kitchen and told Gloria Marsh they were probably due for a slow week. Gloria Marsh said nothing. She had already untied her apron once and retied it again that morning, a habit she had when she was thinking hard about something she wasn't going to say out loud. She turned back to the grill and kept her eyes there. Barnard Keen didn't notice. He rarely did. By Friday noon, pattern was no longer ignorable, but Barnard Keen had developed a new explanation. There was something going on at the base. A training exercise, maybe, or a scheduling change that had pushed the soldiers' meal times around. This happened occasionally. Fort Caldwell ran on its own internal logic, and sometimes that logic disrupted the diner's rhythms for a day or two before settling back to normal. He'd seen it before. He explained this to his short-order cook, Dale. While leaning against the prep counter in a gray short-sleeved shirt and dark work slacks, arms crossed, voice carrying the full weight of a man who had managed this business for 22 years and understood its patterns better than anyone. Dale nodded and flipped a burger for the 2 customers who were actually in the building. Barnard Keen looked at the lunch counter, 7 empty stools in a row, fluorescent overheads, blazing down on nothing, and decided he was right. He was not right. 18 blocks north, at the Millhaven Texaco that Barnard Keen co-owned with his brother Dennis, the morning fuel logs were telling a different story. Dennis Keen called at 12:15, and his voice had an edge that Barnard Keen recognized as worry trying to present itself as curiosity. The base contractor vehicles, the ones that ran supply routes between Fort Caldwell and the civilian suppliers in town, had been filling up at the BP on Route 9 instead. Not all of them, but enough. 3 box trucks that had come through the Texaco every single weekday morning for the past 2 years had not appeared on Wednesday, not on Thursday, and not yet on Friday. Dennis Keen asked if Barnard had heard anything about a contract shift. Barnard Keen said he hadn't, and told Dennis it was probably temporary, and got off the phone. He stood at the diner's front window and looked out at the bright, ordinary Friday street. A woman pushed a stroller past. A kid on a bicycle, a mail truck, Millhaven going about its business like nothing was different, which meant that whatever this was, it was contained. It was a blip. It would correct itself. At the Millhaven Motel on the south end of Garrison Road, the weekend booking sheet was half what it should have been. Owner Pete Farris called the 2 contractors who had canceled their standing weekly reservations and was told simply that the base had shifted its preferred accommodation list. Pete Farris didn't know what that meant. He called his front desk clerk, who pulled up the base's publicly posted vendor guidance page, and there in clean, institutional language that looked like it had been drafted by someone who measured every word was a notice recommending alternative accommodations and dining options for Fort Caldwell personnel and associated contractors operating in the Millhaven area. Keen's diner was named specifically. Pete Farris sat in his motel office under the overhead lights and read the notice 3 times. Then he called his brother-in-law, who ran Farris Hardware on Commerce Street, to find out if he'd seen it. He had. Terry Farris had already lost 3 standing base orders in 48 hours, 2 for lumber supply and 1 for general contractor hardware, and he'd found the memorandum that morning on the Fort Caldwell Public Records portal, which anyone with internet access could reach in about 30 seconds. He read it to Pete over the phone. It was formal and specific and signed with a name and a rank that Terry Farris had looked up afterward because he hadn't recognized it immediately. He recognized it now. Terry Farris had lived in Millhaven his entire life, had supplied Fort Caldwell for 11 years, and he had never once thought carefully about who was actually in command of $40 million in annual local spending authority. He was thinking about it now. Sabrina Holt had been thinking about it since Wednesday morning. The Millhaven Gazette operated out of a narrow 2-story building on Court Street, its second-floor newsroom bright with natural skylight through a bank of east-facing windows and a row of overhead fluorescents that Sabrina Holt kept at full intensity because she believed dim light produced dim thinking. She was 41, wore her hair pulled back tight, and had been editor of the Gazette for 6 years. She had not become editor of a small-town paper in a military community by missing things. The memorandum had come to her attention through a public records search she ran as a matter of routine, and she had confirmed it was authentic with a single call to Fort Caldwell's Public Affairs Office, which acknowledged the document's existence without elaboration, which was exactly what a public affairs office did when something was real and documented, and they had been told not to fan flames. She made 2 more calls, one to a contact in the base's administrative division, one to a county business license office to confirm the ownership structure of Keen's Diner and its affiliated properties. Then she called Barnard Keen. He picked up on the 3rd ring. She identified herself and her publication and told him she was writing a piece on the Fort Caldwell memorandum regarding his establishment and asked if he had a comment. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds, and then the line went dead. Sabrina Holt looked at her phone, set it down on her desk in the bright newsroom, and typed for 40 minutes. The article ran online Friday afternoon and in print Saturday morning. It was 182 words. It stated the facts of the memorandum, its date, its signatory, its scope, and its public record status. It noted that the Gazette had sought comment from the named establishment's owner and received none. It included nothing speculative, nothing inflammatory, nothing that could be disputed or removed. It was the driest, most clinical 182 words that had ever appeared in the Millhaven Gazette. And by Saturday evening, it had been shared 460 times on local social media and had reached Fort Caldwell's unofficial Facebook group, where it received comments for 6 uninterrupted hours. That made it worse than any editorial could have. Facts with no decoration had a way of sitting in a room with you and refusing to leave. Mayor Clifton Pruitt had read it twice before he finished his Saturday morning coffee. He was 53, had been mayor for 8 years, and understood Millhaven's economic architecture with the cold clarity of a man whose political survival depended on it. Fort Caldwell was not a contributor to Millhaven's economy. Fort Caldwell was Millhaven's economy. The base's $40 million annual local spending footprint touched every significant business in the county food service: fuel, lodging, hardware, medical services, automotive, staffing. The soldiers and contractors who lived on and around the base made up 1/3 of the town's regular consumer base. A prolonged withdrawal of that patronage was not a wound. It was a hemorrhage. Clifton Pruitt called 6 members of the Millhaven Business Council before noon and convened an emergency meeting for Sunday morning at Town Hall. The Town Hall conference room was long and fluorescent lit, with windows on the south wall that pushed clean late-morning light across the table where 9 business owners sat in various states of controlled anxiety. Pete Farris was there. Terry Farris was there. The owner of the 2 restaurants that competed with Keen's, who had not yet felt the withdrawal but understood the math, were there. 3 other business owners whose livelihoods were threaded through base spending in less obvious ways were there. Barnard Keen was there, in a pressed blue collared shirt and dark trousers, sitting at the far end of the table with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression of a man who had decided that presence constituted innocence. Clifton Pruitt did not accuse. He asked questions. He presented numbers. He asked the room what they understood about the memorandum's scope and duration and what they understood about their options. The room understood very little about its options. What it understood clearly, what every person sitting under those fluorescent lights understood with increasing and uncomfortable precision, was that one business owner's single act in a single morning had triggered a chain of institutional consequences that none of them had been consulted on and none of them could individually reverse. They looked at Barnard Keen with the particular expression of people who had considered him a peer for decades and were rapidly revising that assessment in real time. Barnard Keen told the room that he had every right to run his establishment as he saw fit and that no memorandum from a military bureaucrat changed that. He said Fort Caldwell had always needed Millhaven more than Millhaven needed Fort Caldwell. He said this would blow over in a week. He said he'd been in business 22 years and had weathered worse. The room let him finish. Nobody agreed out loud. Several people looked at the table. Clifton Prout drove home in the bright Sunday midday light and sat in his driveway for a while before going inside. 12 miles away, on the eastern edge of Fort Caldwell, Colonel Slate was finishing his morning PT formation. He ran at the front of the column, as he always did, a man in a black t-shirt and gray athletic pants moving through the pale early air with 50 soldiers behind him in perfect measured cadence. He called the count in a voice that carried across the formation without effort. His breathing was even. His pace was steady. He did not look distracted. He did not look like a man waiting for anything. When the formation broke, he walked back to his quarters, showered, and made coffee. He poured it into the same plain white mug he used every morning. He sat at the kitchen table where Lena's journal sat in its usual place, closed for now, and he looked out the window at the clear morning over Fort Caldwell, the flags moving in a light wind, the sentry posts in clean geometric order. 30 years of this view in 30 different configurations and always the same essential geometry. He drank his coffee. He had not called anyone. He had not checked the newspaper. He had not asked Vera Colton for a status update or called Malik Ford or made a single inquiry into the consequences unfolding 18 blocks from an empty lunch counter. He had signed the memorandum. He had made 2 handwritten edits. He had done his job with the precision it deserved, and then he had returned to the life he lived, which was orderly and purposeful and entirely undisturbed. The town was starting to feel the walls close in. The town had not yet thought to knock on his door. That moment was coming, but Colonel Slate had spent 30 years learning the difference between the moment that was coming and the moment that was now. Right now, the coffee was hot. The morning was clear. And somewhere in Millhaven, a Sunday meeting had just ended with nobody looking at Barnard Keen the same way they had when it started. The base legal office at Fort Caldwell sat on the second floor of Building 14, a squat administrative block with wide institutional windows that pulled in the full weight of the morning sun. By 9:30 on a Wednesday, the room was bright without apology, overhead fluorescents running clean and white above rows of orderly desks, natural light pressing in from the east-facing windows and laying long pale rectangles across the linoleum floor. It was the kind of light that made everything visible. That was, Vera Colton had always thought, exactly the right kind of room for the work she did. She was at her desk in a pressed army green service uniform, long sleeves buttoned to the wrist, captain's bars catching the light on her collar, when her assistant knocked twice and opened the door. "Ma'am, your 9:30 is here." Vera Colton set down her pen. "Send her in." Gloria Marsh walked through the door carrying a manila folder pressed flat against the front of her navy blue cardigan, her other hand smoothing the hem of her tan slacks the way a person does when they have dressed carefully for something that matters. She was 51 years old, medium height, with close-cropped natural hair going silver at the temples and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who had spent a very long time watching without being watched back. She looked around the room once the commendations on the wall, the stacked legal binders, the American flag standing at attention in the corner, and then she looked at Vera Colton and nodded, as if something she had suspected was confirmed. "Mrs. Marsh," Vera Colton said, standing, "thank you for coming. Please sit down." Gloria Marsh sat. She placed the manila folder on the edge of the desk with both hands, squared it carefully so that it was perfectly parallel to the desk's corner, and then folded her hands on top of it. She did not push it forward yet. She was not ready yet. There was something she needed to say first. "I worked at Keen's Diner for 11 years, she said. Her voice was steady and unhurried. "I want you to understand that number before you open that folder. 11 years. I knew where every coffee pot was kept. I knew which booths got cold drafts in winter. I knew that Barnard Keen took his eggs scrambled dry on Tuesdays and over easy the rest of the week. I knew that place the way you know a house you grew up in. She paused, and I stayed. Vera Colton said nothing. She had learned early in her career that the most important thing a legal officer could do in a first meeting was to keep still and let the witness arrive at the truth on their own schedule. People will ask me why I stayed, Gloria Marsh continued. My sister asked me that last year. My pastor asked me that the year before. And the honest answer is complicated because it's never just one thing. She looked down at the folder. My husband Darnell was out of work for 2 years starting in 2015. My youngest was in her last year of high school. Keen's paid $11.50 an hour plus tips from the soldiers, and the soldiers tipped well. I had insurance through the county my husband was on, so it wasn't the benefits holding me. It was the money, and it was the fact that I told myself every single week that it wasn't bad enough yet to leave. Her jaw tightened slightly, and then it would get a little worse, and I would reset what bad enough meant, and I would stay another week. She slid the folder across the desk. Vera Colton opened it. The first document was a single yellow legal pad page, handwritten, dated September 3, 2013. At the top, in precise, even handwriting, were the words, Incident Record Keen's Diner G. Marsh Personal Copy. Below that, a date, a time, and a sentence that read, Barnard Keen told Table 4 two black men in civilian clothes, appeared to be soldiers, that the booth was reserved, then seated a white couple in the same booth 4 minutes later. I was standing at the counter. I saw it. I wrote it down that night. The pages that followed were more of the same, document after document in the same careful handwriting, each one dated, each one specific. A customer turned away from the lunch counter with an excuse about seating that didn't hold up against the empty stools visible to everyone in the room. A slur used in the kitchen, low but audible, directed at Gloria Marsh on a Thursday morning in February 2016 when she had asked about a scheduling error in her hours. 3 separate instances across 2 years in which Gloria Marsh's logged hours on the paper timesheet did not match what appeared on her paycheck, each one documented with the original timesheet carbon she had quietly kept. There were 47 pages in total, 47 separate entries across 11 years. Vera Colton read without speaking. Her face gave nothing away, but her right hand, resting on the desk beside the folder, had gone very still. The last section, Gloria Marsh said quietly. Vera Colton turned to it. The document was a photocopy, slightly faded at the edges from age and handling. It was a civil complaint, filed in Harwell County Superior Court in March of 2014 by a plaintiff named Marcus Webb against one Barnard Keen, owner-operator of Keen's Diner. Marcus Webb had been a kitchen worker at Keen's for 3 years. The complaint documented a termination that Marcus Webb alleged was racially motivated, detailed 2 incidents of documented verbal harassment, and included a witness statement from a second employee whose name had been redacted in this copy. The complaint had been filed on a Friday. By the following Wednesday, it had been withdrawn. Attached to the photocopy was a 1-page settlement summary on the letterhead of Raymond Voss, attorney at law, noting that the matter had been resolved pursuant to a confidential agreement, the terms of which were binding on both parties. Gloria Marsh's voice, when she spoke, was very quiet. Marcus worked with me for 3 of those years. He was 24 when Barnard let him go. He'd been there through a slow winter and worked every shift he was asked to work and never once gave Barnard any cause. But Barnard had a cousin who needed kitchen work, and Marcus was gone within a week. She paused. Marcus filed that complaint on his own. He found an attorney in Raleigh who took it on contingency. And then 6 days later, Raymond Voss called that attorney with a number, and the attorney told Marcus it was the practical choice. Her hands came apart on the desk. Marcus came to see me the night before he left Millhaven. He had a copy of the settlement summary, and he gave it to me. He said he didn't know why exactly, but he wanted someone here to have it, someone who would understand what it meant. Did he ask you to do anything with it? Vera Colton asked. No, Gloria Marsh said. He just said keep it safe, so I did. For 10 years I kept it in the back of my hall closet in a shoebox under my winter sweaters. She looked directly at Vera Colton. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth is I was scared. Barnard Keen has relationships in this town that go back 30 years. He is on the business council. He golfs with the county commissioner. I knew what happened to Marcus Webb when he tried to push back with a lawyer and a legal filing and documented evidence. He took $60,000 and left town. Her voice did not waver, but something in it deepened. I had a family here. Vera Colton looked up from the folder. What changed? Gloria Marsh was quiet for a moment. Through the window behind Vera Colton's desk, the morning sky over Fort Caldwell was clear and enormous and very blue. I was there, Gloria Marsh said. I was working the counter the morning that Colonel Slate came in. She said the name the way soldiers said it, not with fanfare, but with the particular weight of genuine respect. I had seen soldiers come in and out of that diner for 11 years. I had seen Barnard be rude to them, dismiss them, shortchange them in ways so small that none of them would think to file a complaint over a single incident. But what he said to that man. She stopped. I have watched people be humiliated in that diner. I have watched Barnard say things that made grown men go quiet to keep the peace. But Colonel Slate did not go quiet to keep the peace. He just looked at Barnard and said what he said and walked out. And something about the way he walked out made me understand that the peace was already over. She straightened in her chair. I went home that night and I took my folder down from the shelf. And I sat at my kitchen table and I read every single page I'd written over 11 years, and I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. I wasn't just a witness, I was evidence. Vera Colton sat with that for a moment, then she looked back at the folder. The non-disclosure agreement bound Marcus Webb, she said carefully. It did not bind you, you were not a party to that settlement. I know, Gloria Marsh said. And you're prepared to provide this folder, including the settlement summary, to this office voluntarily as part of a legal review. I came here this morning, didn't I? Gloria Marsh said. There was nothing sharp in her voice. It was simply a statement of fact. Vera Colton nodded slowly. She closed the folder and held it for a moment with both hands, and the room was very quiet around the sound of the fluorescents and the distant sound of a formation running cadence somewhere across the base courtyard. 47 handwritten incident records. A suppressed 2014 civil complaint. A non-disclosure settlement paid to make a young black man disappear quietly from a town where he'd done nothing wrong. A waitress who had spent 11 years building a paper trail in secret because something in her had refused to let it go entirely undocumented, even when she was too afraid to use it. I want to ask you something, Vera Colton said. Not for the record, just person to person. Gloria Marsh nodded. Are you all right? The question landed differently than Gloria Marsh had expected. Her expression shifted, not breaking, but opening slightly. The way a door opens when the pressure on the other side is finally relieved. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I will be. I think I've been waiting to be all right for about 10 years. I think I'm closer now than I was last week. Vera Colton held her gaze and nodded. Then she stood, the folder in her hand, and walked to the door of the office and opened it. Her assistant was at the desk in the outer room, phone in hand. I need Sergeant Delacroix in here, Vera Colton said, and I need a chain of custody form for physical evidence. She looked back once at Gloria Marsh, and then she turned back to her assistant and added the words that would set the next machinery in motion, quiet as a key turning in a lock, certain as anything that had ever been set in motion in that bright, visible room. Get the JAG team on this, she said, and copy the ER. 2 weeks is not a long time in a town like Millhaven. 2 weeks is not long enough to forget a summer or remember a name or finish painting a porch. But 2 weeks is long enough to feel 60% of your revenue walk out the door and not come back. 2 weeks is long enough for a slow week to stop being slow and start being something else entirely. 2 weeks is long enough for a town to decide who it is willing to sacrifice to save itself. Mayor Clifton Prout drove to Fort Caldwell on a Wednesday morning with his tie straight and his hands unsteady on the wheel. The drive was 18 minutes, the same 18 minutes Colonel Humphrey Slate had driven 2 weeks ago after walking out of Keen's diner with nothing but his quiet and his dignity. Clifton Prout had driven this road 100 times for ribbon cuttings and handshakes and budget consultations. He had never driven it feeling this small. The Fort Caldwell Visitor Processing Center was bright and orderly under a wide November sky, the overhead fluorescent lighting inside the building clean and unforgiving, the kind of light that leaves no comfortable shadows to stand in. A young corporal with sharp shoulders checked Prout's identification and issued a visitor badge without expression. Prout was escorted through a corridor that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and institutional authority, past a row of framed photographs of command personnel that he did not stop to look at, and into a conference room where morning light fell through tall windows that faced east. Colonel Humphrey Slate was already seated when Prout entered. He wore his service uniform, the one with the shoulder eagles and the rows of service ribbons that required 3 lines to contain. His posture was the kind that does not come from effort, but from 30 years of becoming something permanent. 2 uniformed staff members sat to his left with legal pads. Vera Colton, the base legal officer, sat to his right in a crisp uniform jacket, her expression professionally neutral in the way that very prepared people learn to keep it. Prout sat down across the table and felt the distance between them immediately. "Mayor Prout," Humphrey Slate said, "thank you for coming out." The courtesy was genuine and complete and offered no opening whatsoever. Prout had prepared remarks. He delivered them: the town's economic dependence on Fort Caldwell, the ripple effect through the business community, the families who were not directly connected to Barnard Keen but were feeling the contraction. He was careful to avoid the word unfair. He said the word community 7 times. He watched Humphrey Slate listen the way a man listens when he has already heard everything being said and has already decided what he thinks about it. When Prout finished, Humphrey Slate folded his hands on the table. "The memorandum is a command prerogative issued in response to a documented incident at a commercial establishment," he said. "It will remain in place pending the outcome of a formal discrimination review currently in progress. That process has a timeline and a procedure, and I have every confidence it will be conducted thoroughly." Prout nodded slowly. "And if Mr. Keen were to, if there was some kind of gesture, some public acknowledgement, what Mr. Keen does or does not do is a matter for the review process, Mayor, not for me personally." The sentence was not unkind. It was a wall built with such precision that there were no handholds anywhere on its surface. Prout looked at Vera Colton, who looked back at him with the same professional neutrality she had maintained since he walked in. He looked at the 2 staff members who were writing things on their legal pads that were probably not about him. He stood up 5 minutes later, shook Humphrey Slate's hand, thanked him for his time with a sincerity that came out cracked at the edges, and walked back down the corridor past the photographs he still did not stop to look at. The corporal retrieved his visitor badge at the processing center. The fluorescent lights hummed above the exit. Clifton Prout drove back to Millhaven with nothing. 18 minutes. Same road. The Millhaven Business Council met that Thursday evening in the back room of the Chamber of Commerce office on Garner Street, a room with a drop ceiling and overhead fluorescent panels and a folding table long enough to seat 12. 9 of the 12 chairs were filled. Barnard Keen sat at one end with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression he had been wearing for 2 weeks, the one that said this would all resolve itself if everyone would just calm down. It did not resolve itself. Derek Thorne, who owned the Millhaven Motel, spoke first. He said the motel had lost 14 booked contractor stays in the past 2 weeks and that 3 standing monthly accounts connected to base personnel had been quietly redirected to a property in Carver County. He said this without accusation and without heat, but he looked directly at Barnard Keen while he said it. Phyllis Ames, who ran the lunch counter at the pharmacy on Clement Street, said her afternoon traffic from base personnel was gone. She had not seen a uniform in 11 days. Carl Briggs, whose family had run the hardware supply operation for 30 years, said 2 standing base purchase orders had been administratively redirected, and that a 3rd was under review. He said the word administratively the way people say it when they want you to understand that something official and irreversible has begun to move. 3 of them asked Barnard Keen to step down from the council, not in accusation, not in anger, in the flat, exhausted tone of people who have done the arithmetic and arrived at an answer they did not enjoy. Barnard Keen told them they were being dramatic. He said the memorandum was a temporary measure from a man who had got his feelings hurt, and that these things have a way of working themselves out. He said he had an attorney handling it. What he did not know, sitting at that folding table under those fluorescent lights, was that he had not had an attorney for the past 4 hours. Raymond Voss had called that afternoon from his office in Winston-Salem, and his voice had been the voice of a man who has already made his decision and is now simply delivering its consequences. He told Barnard Keen that the 2014 settlement, the one involving Marcus Webb, the one drafted under a non-disclosure agreement that Voss himself had structured, was now under federal review by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. He said that his firm's continued representation in the matter constituted a conflict of interest he was not willing to carry. He said the word withdrawing once clearly and did not repeat it. He told Barnard Keen he would need to find alternative counsel. He wished him well in the procedural sense that means the opposite and ended the call. Barnard Keen had sat in the diner for an hour after that call, alone in the dining room that used to fill up without effort, under the fluorescent lights that used to feel like his, reading the memorandum he had pinned to his corkboard 2 weeks ago like it was a joke someone had mailed him. He was not laughing now. The church hall at Greater Providence AME on Meridian Avenue seated 210 people. On the Thursday evening of the third week after the memorandum, every seat was filled, and 14 people stood along the back wall under the bright overhead lights. Pastor Wendell Cross stood at the front in a dark suit jacket and open-collar white shirt, a broad man with a careful voice that carried to every corner of the room without rising. He did not open the meeting with anger. He opened it with names. He read the names of black residents of Millhaven who had filed informal complaints with the Chamber of Commerce about Keen's Diner over the past decade. 6 names. He read the dates next to each name. He said that none of those complaints had produced a response from the Chamber's Business Standards Committee. He said this the way a man says something that the room already knows but has never heard said out loud in a room together. Then he opened the floor. What followed was 2 hours that Millhaven would not forget. A woman named Dolores Harper, who had lived on Pinecrest Road for 31 years, stood up and said that Barnard Keen had told her in 2019 that a table she was waiting for had been reserved, and then she had watched it fill with white customers who had walked in after her. She said she had gone home and told her daughter, and her daughter had told her to let it go, and she had let it go, and she was tired of having let things go. She sat down to the sound of 200 people who understood exactly what she meant. A man named Curtis Finley, who drove a delivery route through Millhaven 3 times a week, said Barnard Keen had told him in 2021 that the counter seats were for regulars and pointed him toward a 2-top near the restroom corridor. He said he had eaten his meal and left a tip anyway because his mother raised him a certain way, and that he had thought about that tip every time he drove past the diner since. Story after story, not shouts, not performances, just the steady, cumulative weight of people who had absorbed small violences for years and had never been given a room large enough to put them all in at once. Pastor Wendell Cross let every voice finish. He thanked every person by name. At the end of the meeting, he announced that Greater Providence AME was formally partnering with a regional civil rights organization to provide support services for any Millhaven resident wishing to add their account to the EOC documentation already in progress. He said the organization's name clearly and asked Sabrina Holt from the Gazette, who was seated in the second row with a notepad, if she had gotten it. She confirmed that she had. Sabrina Holt's second piece ran in the Millhaven Gazette on Friday morning with a headline that used no exclamation point and needed none. It named the 2014 settlement. It named the amount $60,000. It named Marcus Webb, who had agreed to speak on record from his home in Raleigh, where he had moved after leaving Millhaven 9 years ago. Marcus Webb said in the article that the settlement had come with a document he had signed in a room with Raymond Voss, and that he had signed it because he needed the money and was 24 years old and did not know what else to do. He said he had given a copy of the documents to a woman at the diner who had been kind to him because he wanted someone who stayed to know what had happened. He did not say Gloria Marsh's name, but anyone who had eaten at Keen's Diner in the past 11 years knew exactly who had stayed. By Saturday afternoon, Sabrina Holt's article had been shared across 3 regional news platforms and picked up for reference by a paper out of Charlotte that had a circulation of 80,000. Barnard Keen's brother Dale issued a statement through his own hardware business's social media page. It was 4 sentences. It said that Dale Keen wished to make clear that his business operated independently of his brother's establishment, that he supported a full and fair review of the incidents described in recent reporting, and that he would be cooperating with any inquiry that came to him. It did not mention Barnard Keen by first name. It did not mention the diner at all. Barnard Keen was now alone in a way that money had previously prevented. His attorney was gone. His brother had moved to the other side of public line. 3 council members had asked for his seat. His dining room was running at 30% of its prior volume, and the 30% that remained was quieter than it used to be, as if even the people still coming were reconsidering. He sat at the counter on Saturday evening in the empty diner, the overhead fluorescents buzzing above him the way they always had, the same lights that had lit 30 years of Saturday nights and full counters and a version of himself that had never imagined this particular accounting. He looked at the corkboard by the kitchen pass-through. The memorandum was still pinned to it. 2 weeks of exposure had not yellowed it. It looked exactly as official as the morning it arrived. In the kitchen pass-through behind him, the spot where Gloria Marsh had stood for 11 years with her order pad and her unspoken knowledge and her carefully kept folder, there was no one. The question that sat in the empty diner with Barnard Keen that evening was the same question that had begun forming in Millhaven the moment the soldiers stopped coming, the same question that 200 people in a church hall had given their answers to, the same question that $60,000 had temporarily buried in 2014 and that Federal Review was now carefully unburying. It was not a complicated question. It was simply this: what does it cost, finally, to be who you have always been? Barnard Keen did not have the answer yet, but somewhere in Millhaven, in a church hall and a newspaper office and a legal brief, and the memory of a woman who kept 11 years of dates in a manila folder, the answer was being assembled, and it was nearly complete. The phone on Humphrey Slate's desk rang at 2:14 in the afternoon. The office was bright the way it always was at that hour overhead, fluorescence steady and unwavering above, and the wide institutional windows behind his desk pulling in a full sheet of November afternoon light that landed across his mahogany desk like something deliberate. His commendations lined the wall to his left in measured rows, the kind of arrangement that didn't announce itself but didn't apologize either. A cup of black coffee sat at his right hand, still warm. He was reviewing a logistics briefing when the internal line blinked, and his aide's voice came through the intercom with a particular quality to it, careful, like a man choosing his next step on uncertain ground. "Sir, I have a Barnard Keen on the line. He says Mayor Prout gave him this number." Humphrey Slate set the briefing down with the same economy of motion he used for everything. He straightened once in his chair. He looked at the phone for exactly 1 second, which was not hesitation, it was the same pause a man takes before lifting something he has carried before and knows the weight of precisely. "Put him through," he said. The line clicked. A silence followed that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, though it carried the density of something much longer. Then Barnard Keen's voice arrived, and it was not the voice from the diner. That voice had been round and self-satisfied, the voice of a man who had never once needed to account for the space he occupied. This voice was compressed. It had been through something. The dining room authority was gone the way water leaves a cloth, not all at once, but completely by the time you notice. "Colonel Slate," a pause. "This is Barnard Keen, from Keen's Diner." "I know who you are," Humphrey Slate said. His voice was even, not cold. Even. Another silence from Barnard Keen's end. In the background, if you listened carefully, you could hear the particular quiet of a room that used to be full of people and was not anymore. The ambient sound of absence. A chair scraping faintly against linoleum. The low hum of kitchen equipment that had nothing to cook. "I'm calling because," Barnard Keen started and then stopped. He started again. "I want to apologize for what happened. When you came in, what I said to you." The words came out with the texture of something rehearsed and then partially forgotten, the way a man speaks when he has written out what he planned to say and the paper is not in front of him anymore. "It wasn't right, and I shouldn't have done it. And the diner, this whole situation with the memorandum, my people are hurting, Colonel. The whole town is taking a hit. I've got staff who've been with me for years who are looking at cut hours. And the guys over at Prout's Hardware," he kept going. Humphrey Slate let him. This was a discipline that 30 years had built into him, the way water builds stone into canyon walls, not quickly, not dramatically, but to a depth that cannot be argued with. He let Barnard Keen talk, because a man who has never had to account for himself will always reveal the shape of his soul in the first version of his apology. You did not need to ask questions. You only needed to be still. Barnard Keen talked about the gas station revenue. He talked about contractor bookings at the motel being down 40%. He talked about his brother not speaking to him right now and about Mayor Prout calling him twice a day. He talked about the business council and the meeting where 3 men he had known for 20 years asked him to step down from his seat. He talked about Raymond Voss withdrawing. He talked about the Federal Review and what his accountant had told him about the exposure there. He did not talk about Marcus Webb until the 4th minute, and when he did, it was with the careful phrasing of a man trying to minimize the terrain he was crossing, a settlement, a misunderstanding, something that had been handled. He did not say the word discrimination. He did not say the word pattern. He did not say Gloria Marsh's name at all. When he finished, he said, "So I'm hoping we can work something out, for the town's sake." Humphrey Slate did not speak immediately. The afternoon light through the windows behind him had moved slightly, the way it does in November when the sun is lower and the angle changes more noticeably hour to hour. The room was still bright. His coffee had gone cold. He had not touched it since the phone rang. When he spoke, his voice carried no performance in it, no heat, no theater. It carried only the full, undecorated weight of a man who has lived long enough to know the precise difference between grief and anger, between patience and surrender, and between an apology and a transaction dressed in apology's clothing. "Mr. Keen," he said, "my wife's name was Lena. She passed 4 years ago this March. She kept a journal her whole life, and she left it to me when she went, and I read it still." He did not pause for effect. He spoke the way a man speaks when he is saying something true rather than something crafted. "She wrote once, during a time when someone had done us a wrong and then come to us with words about it, and nothing else. She wrote that an apology without accountability is just noise, that it's noise that asks the person who was wrong to carry the noise as if it was something real." He let that sit for a moment. "I have been thinking about that line for 3 weeks. Barnard Keen said nothing. "You called me today because your revenue is down and your attorney withdrew and the Federal Review has you scared," Humphrey Slate continued. "I understand that. I want you to understand that I understand it. I'm not confused about why this call is happening." He shifted once in his chair, settling into the posture of a man who has not raised his voice and will not. "But I want to tell you what this phone call actually needs to contain, because I don't think you came prepared with the right version of it." He spoke for 4.5 minutes without interruption. He told Barnard Keen that accountability, in this case, looked like a public statement, not a press release drafted by a lawyer and issued through a law firm's letterhead, but a statement delivered by Barnard Keen himself, in public, in Millhaven, acknowledging not the single incident at the diner counter, but the documented pattern. Marcus Webb. The settlement, the 11 years of incidents Gloria Marsh had recorded in her own hand and placed on a federal legal officer's desk. He told Barnard Keen that the statement needed to acknowledge those things by name and without softening language, because the softening language was exactly what had allowed the pattern to continue for 11 years, while men like Raymond Voss processed the paperwork that kept it quiet. He told Barnard Keen that full cooperation with the EOC review was not optional and was not a bargaining position, it was a floor, and anything below that floor was not a conversation he was interested in having. He told Barnard Keen that a community meeting needed to happen, convened not by Barnard Keen's representation, but by Pastor Wendell Cross and his organization, on a timeline that Pastor Cross determined appropriate, in a space that the community felt was theirs. He told Barnard Keen that Gloria Marsh needed to be at that meeting and that Barnard Keen needed to stand in a room with her and the people of Millhaven and say what he had done and what he intended to do without a podium between himself and the weight of it. He told Barnard Keen that none of this was punishment. He was precise about that. He said, "I'm not interested in your punishment. I'm interested in what Millhaven looks like on the other side of this. I'm interested in what Gloria Marsh's situation looks like. I'm interested in whether Marcus Webb, who left this town because of what you did, gets to hear something honest said publicly about what happened to him." He paused once. "And I'm interested in whether this town learns something real or whether it just waits for the pressure to ease and then goes back to the way things were." He did not say, "I am Fort Caldwell." He did not say, "I hold 40 million of this town's economic future in my command authority." He did not need to. Both men understood the architecture of the moment completely. "That," Humphrey Slate said, "is what this phone call needs to contain." Barnard Keen was quiet for a long time, not the silence of a man preparing a counterargument, the silence of a man sitting with something he cannot make smaller than it is. "I hear you," he said finally. His voice had lost another register. Something had come down that had been load-bearing. "I'll reach out to the pastor." "You do that," Humphrey Slate said, and then, "Mr. Keen." One more pause. The afternoon light was full on his desk now, the commendations on the wall catching it faintly. "My wife also wrote that the hardest thing a person can do is stand up straight in the room where they did the wrong thing. She said most people never do it. They find a side door." His voice did not waver. "Don't find the side door." He placed the phone back in its cradle with the same quiet economy with which he had lifted the logistics briefing 40 minutes ago. He sat for a moment. He looked at his cold coffee. He did not drink it. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one with the worn leather journal in it, and he laid his hand flat on the cover for just a moment, not opening it, just resting there. Then he closed the drawer, picked up the briefing, and returned to work. Outside the windows, the November afternoon continued, unhurried and fully lit, across Millhaven. On the east side of town, where Dunning Street ran long and straight past the barber shop and the community garden that had gone in 2 summers ago, Malik Ford was sitting at a four-top table in Rosalind's kitchen, which had operated for 9 years under a woman named Rosalind Tate, who made biscuits from a recipe her grandmother brought north from Georgia. Malik Ford was in a navy blue short-sleeve shirt and dark chinos, off-duty. His phone face down on the table beside a glass of sweet tea. In front of him was a plate of smothered chicken with rice and a side of collard greens, and the dining room around him was full in a way it had not been full 3 weeks ago. There were faces from the base. He recognized soldiers in civilian clothes, contractors he knew by sight, a few NCOs from the motor pool having a late lunch 2 tables over. The overhead lights in Rosalind's kitchen were warm fluorescents, and the front windows were wide and uncovered, pulling in the afternoon light so that the whole room was bright and easy, and loud with the sound of people eating without any weight on their shoulders. Malik Ford cut into his chicken. He chewed once. He looked at nothing in particular for a moment, just the middle distance above the table. And something moved briefly across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite something else. It was simply the expression of a man who made 1 phone call 3 weeks ago and is eating the meal that should have been eaten then. He picked up his sweet tea. He drank. He set it down. On Dunning Street, the afternoon moved through Millhaven at the pace that November afternoons move, steady, indifferent to the drama of the people beneath them, golden at the edges and fully present in the middle. And 3 miles away on the other side of town, under the fluorescent lights of Keen's diner, Barnard Keen sat alone at the counter he had stood behind for 22 years. Looking at the memorandum still pinned to his corkboard, exactly where he had put it on the morning, a junior NCO had walked in without ceremony and placed it in his hands. He had laughed at it then. He had read it once and laughed, and pinned it up like a joke. He looked at it now with the eyes of a man who has just gotten off a phone call with someone who spoke to him without rage, without theater, without a single raised syllable, and somehow that was the thing that had made it impossible to pretend anymore. He read it again, every word. For the first time, he finally understood what he was holding. 6 weeks after the memorandum, Millhaven held a town hall meeting inside the Calvary Community Church on Brennan Street. Pastor Wendell Cross had arranged every detail: the folding chairs lined in tight rows, the podium borrowed from the library, the wide overhead lights blazing full and warm against the morning sky visible through the clerestory windows above. Every seat was filled before 9 o'clock. People stood along the back wall. Some stood outside the open side doors and listened through the gap. Barnard Keen stood at the podium in a white button-down shirt and dark trousers, and he did not look comfortable. He had not been meant to look comfortable. This was not a press release sent through Raymond Voss's office. Voss was gone. This was a man standing in front of 230 people who knew exactly who he was. Reading words that Pastor Wendell Cross had quietly insisted must include every specific thing he had done, not a general regret, not a vague expression of sorrow, but a full accounting delivered out loud, in the building where half the people he had wronged had prayed every Sunday for years. The statement was not graceful. His voice broke in the wrong places and steadied in others. He stumbled over Marcus Webb's name twice. He did not cry, and no one expected him to. But he read every line. He named the 2014 settlement. He named Gloria Marsh. He named the pattern. He said the words, "I created a hostile environment. I paid to bury the truth. And I used my diner as a place where some people were welcome and others were not." The room was silent in a way that silence rarely is. It was not the silence of agreement or absolution. It was the silence of a community deciding collectively what to do with a truth it had suspected for years and was now finally holding in its hands. When he finished, no one applauded. He stepped back from the podium, and Pastor Wendell Cross stepped forward, and the meeting continued without fanfare or ceremony in Barnard Keen's direction. That was, perhaps, the most precise consequence of all. Marcus Webb was in the third row wearing a navy blue polo shirt and gray slacks. He had driven 4 hours from Charlotte the night before and slept on a cousin's couch. When Gloria Marsh walked to the front of the room to speak, he stood up. She saw him before she reached the podium. She stopped in the middle of the aisle, and the two of them looked at each other across 11 years and a silence that a $60,000 non-disclosure agreement had purchased but never truly enforced. He nodded once. She nodded back. Then she walked the rest of the way to the podium, and when she finished speaking about the 11 years, about the folder, about the apron she had untied without drama that morning 6 weeks ago, she stepped down, and Marcus Webb was there, and he took her hand in both of his and shook it in front of every person in that room. And that was the moment the church exhaled. The EOC review was ongoing. Keen's diner remained open, technically, but it operated at a fraction of its former traffic. The memorandum had been officially lifted 2 weeks prior. Humphrey Slate had signed that document with the same even hand with which he had signed the first one. But the soldiers largely did not return. They had found other places. 3 black-owned restaurants within 7 miles of Fort Caldwell had expanded their capacity in the preceding month to meet the new demand. A veteran-owned sandwich counter on Depot Road had added 4 outdoor tables and hired 2 part-time staff. The economic geography of Millhaven had not snapped back. It had shifted, the way land shifts after a long rain, permanently, quietly, and without asking anyone's permission. Gloria Marsh's catering operation launched the following Thursday. She called it Marsh Table. The microloan had come through a Veterans Community Development Fund. Humphrey Slate had made one phone call to the fund's director, a woman he'd served with in Germany, and mentioned Gloria's name. He had not directed anything further. The work was Gloria's. The license was Gloria's. The industrial kitchen she rented by the hour in the back of a church hall 2 blocks from her apartment was hers. She had her first 3 bookings before the week was out. Sabrina Holt's 2-part series ran in the Millhaven Gazette, and then the Raleigh Tribune picked it up and ran a condensed version on a Sunday. Her name appeared under the byline in a paper with a circulation 40 times larger than anything she had published in before. She read it at her desk under the fluorescent lights of the Gazette's small office, and then she put the paper down and started writing the next story, because there were always more. On a clear Wednesday afternoon, Humphrey Slate drove alone to Maplewood Cemetery on the north edge of town. The sky was open and pale blue, and the afternoon light came down without obstruction, no shadows worth naming, just the clean, even brightness of a day that had decided not to hide anything. He wore a charcoal Henley and dark trousers and carried nothing in his hands except Lena's journal. He stood at her headstone for a long time without speaking. Then he placed the journal flat on top of the stone, the worn leather cover facing up, and he spoke to her in a low voice about what had happened, not as a victor's report, not as a man cataloging his own strength, but as a man who missed his wife and wanted her to know that her words had traveled further than she could have imagined when she wrote them. He told her it wasn't his. He told her it was the town's. He told her it was hers. Then he picked up the journal and put it back in his jacket pocket, close to his chest, where it had always lived. He had told Barnard Keen on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks ago, in a voice that carried no rage and every intention, "I won't forget this." He never did, and neither will Millhaven. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.